Welcome to BIMS TV. I'm Chanté Lively, and this is BIMS Bites. Today, I'll be biting into Georgia's Oyster Reefs. Let's go over a quick refresher on Georgia's coast. The state of Georgia is home to 100 miles of coast connected to the Atlantic Ocean. It also has around 14 barrier islands situated between the mainland coast and the Atlantic Ocean. The shape and size of these islands are constantly changing. And on each island, you'll find a wide range of ecosystems such as the maritime forests, coastal beaches, estuaries, salt marshes, and oyster reefs, which is what we'll be talking about today. Check out the previous BIMS Bites episodes on the maritime forest and salt marsh for more information on those ecosystems. So what's an oyster? An oyster is a bivalve invertebrate with two long grayish-white asymmetrical shells. This mollusk is a sessile organism with one shell attached permanently to a hard surface. They are filter feeders who filter water over their gills to remove detritus and plankton from the water for food. Some common predators are crabs like the stone crab and mud crab and blue crab, moon snails, oyster drills, oyster toadfish, and the bird, the oyster catcher. These predators have cool adaptations in order to crack open the oyster's hard shell and eat its soft body interior. The oyster found in Georgia is the eastern oyster, Crassostrea virginica. You might see oysters more commonly at restaurants, but this species is native to the eastern coast of the American continents, from Canada to the Yucatan Peninsula and the West Indies. An oyster reef ecosystem exists alongside salt marsh edges and often estuaries. They can be found intertidally, between the tides, or subtidally. As you can see from this picture, wild Georgia oysters grow in clumps due to naturally high recruitment rates, a lack of habitat on which to settle, and competition for space. The ecosystem services of oysters are just so vast. Oysters are ecosystem engineers, organisms that directly or indirectly affect their environment to suit their needs. Oysters create such large reefs that change the environment around them. Many species depend on oysters as a food source in multiple stages of an oyster's life cycle, from oyster spat or larvae attached to a hard surface that are an important food source for mud crabs to humans that love fully grown oysters. Did you know one oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day? How amazing is that? They can filter and remove chemical compounds, bacteria, and even viruses known to cause disease. An oyster reef forms living shorelines, a natural form of protection against coastal hazards like storm surge. They are critical refuge and habitat for many different fish and invertebrate species. They are an indicator species as their health and abundance can inform scientists about changing conditions in the ecosystem. And lastly, oyster reef ecosystems are for the culture. Oysters are such an ingrained part of the culture in coastal Georgia and other coastal communities, from recreational activities to cultural history. Farmed oysters, clams, and mussels, which live in or on a oyster reef habitat, even account for about 2/3 of the total U.S. marine aquaculture production. Here are some of the threats oysters face. In Georgia, eastern oysters were once in abundance and heavily fished along the coastal estuaries during the late 1800s and early 1900s. In 1908, Georgia led the nation in oyster harvesting, primarily for the oyster canning industry. There were abundant oysters and at least 13 oyster canneries along the coast. However, their importance has declined since the 1930s because of overharvesting, and the industry is no longer Georgia's main fishery resource today. Since the overharvesting and an increase in coastal development with around 500,000 Georgians living on the coast, there have been changes in the total area and decreases in total acreage of reefs. With less reefs, there's a shell shortage, decreasing spat recruitment. Pollution, specifically non-point, is a huge threat thanks to our large coastal population. Urbanization, agricultural processes, and improper discharge of sewage are all types of non-point source pollution that eventually end up in coastal waters. And rising sea levels is a problem in all coastal communities. But what are some solutions different organizations in Georgia have found to these threats? Lots of people like to eat an oyster. I'm not one of them. But the demand for oysters in Georgia outgrows the harvest and availability on the coast, especially in Georgia where the demand is high, but wild oysters grow in clumps and aren't preferred by consumers. Many state and federal agencies now consider aquaculture as a primary means of future production of the nation's seafood. Oyster aquaculture brings economic benefits and supports tourism. In 2015, UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant created the first oyster hatchery in Georgia. Hatcheries are an environmentally friendly and controlled way to start the early stages of an oyster life cycle, specifically SPAC. Georgia's hatchery grows single-shell oysters, which are easy to open, easier to distribute, and more marketable to upscale restaurants. With depleting shorelines and rising sea levels, different entities throughout coastal Georgia have been looking into ways to protect the coast. One of them is reef restoration and artificial reefs. Through one initiative, oyster shells are collected from the community. The shells are then prepared for construction by oyster bags, pallets, crab traps, and lots of new innovative ways. The construction is planted in estuaries to provide habitat for oyster SPAC to adhere to. The shell inside the bags or on top of the construction create the substrate for oysters and other organisms to attach and grow during the upcoming spawning season. This picture is of one artificial reef that was placed in the Skidaway River to test for effectiveness. The effectiveness of artificial reefs depends on a variety of different factors, such as temperature, oyster growth, and oyster survival, as well as shell heights and widths. This whole presentation has just been a snippet of information surrounding Georgia's oyster reef ecosystems. To continue your knowledge on Georgia oysters, look into these two organizations, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Coastal Resource Division, and UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. Both are doing important conservation work, research, and educational activities surrounding Georgia's coastal ecosystems. Thanks so much for watching this BIMS Bite on Georgia's Oyster Reefs. Once again, I am Chanté Lively, and if you want to hear me gush more about Georgia ecosystems, feel free to check out my website or reach out to me by email. Please follow, like, and subscribe Black and Marine Science on all social media handles. And I'll see you soon. Bye.